The tasting table was set with white linen and 4 slices of cake, and Margaret Calloway had already decided, before she took a single bite, that none of them would do. She was 63, the kind of wealthy that no longer required explanation, and she was planning her only son's wedding the way she had once run 3 companies, by deciding what was acceptable and eliminating everything else. The reception hall alone had cost more than most people's houses. The flowers were flown in from 2 continents, and now, 3 weeks before the wedding, she was staring at a modest lemon lavender cake from a neighborhood bakery and wondering how her son's fiancé had ever agreed to something so small. "It's charming," Margaret said, in the tone she used for things she intended to discard. "But charming isn't what 300 guests expect, Sophia. We'll bring in Antoine Marchetti. He did the Hendricks wedding." Sophia Whitmore, 29, sat very still with her hands folded in her lap. She had said yes to nearly everything in the last 4 months. The venue she hadn't chosen, the guest list that had ballooned past anyone she actually knew, the dress her future mother-in-law had all but selected for her. But the cake was not negotiable, and she did not yet know how to explain why without opening a door to a part of her life Margaret had never asked about and Sophia had never offered. "I want Rosa's bakery," Sophia said quietly. "It has to be Rosa's." Margaret's eyebrows rose half an inch, which for her was the equivalent of a raised voice. "The little shop on Delancey." "Sophia, I looked into her. She has no formal pastry credentials. She's been running that shop alone since her husband passed, God knows how many years. It's a lovely story. It is not a wedding cake." What Margaret did not know, what nobody in that gleaming tasting room knew except Sophia and her mother, who was not even in the room yet, was that Rosa Delgado's small bakery on Delancey Street was the only reason Sophia's family had survived a winter 18 years ago that should have broken them completely. Before we continue, if you believe that gratitude has no expiration date and grace wears no uniform, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. Sophia had been 11 years old when her father died. A car accident on a rain-slicked highway. The kind of loss that arrives without warning and leaves a family standing in a life that no longer fits. Her mother, Elena, had worked 2 jobs and still couldn't cover the funeral costs, let alone the mortgage that followed. They were 3 weeks from losing the house when Elena walked into a bakery on Delancey Street looking for day-old bread they could afford. And a woman behind the counter, Rosa, then in her late 40s, her own husband recently gone too, looked at Elena's face and understood something before a single word was spoken. Rosa didn't offer charity. She offered work, 6 mornings a week before dawn, kneading dough and frosting cakes for a wage that was modest but steady, plus whatever bread didn't sell by closing, which somehow was always more than a little. She let 11-year-old Sophia do her homework at the back table after school, surrounded by the smell of vanilla and yeast, and never once made either of them feel like they were being rescued. She simply made room. For 2 years, until Elena found steadier work. That bakery was the floor beneath a family that had nearly fallen through. Sophia had not set foot in that shop in almost a decade. Life, distance, the slow drift of adulthood had carried her elsewhere. But the moment she began planning her wedding, there was only one cake she could imagine cutting. Not because it would be the most impressive, because it would be true. "It has to be Rosa's," Sophia said again. And this time her voice did not waver, even as Margaret's expression tightened into the particular patience wealthy people reserve for sentimentality they don't yet understand. "I'll speak with her myself," Margaret said, already reaching for her phone. "Perhaps we can find a compromise. A tasting at her shop so I can see exactly what we're working with." 2 days later, Margaret Calloway walked into Rosa Delgado's bakery on Delancey Street wearing a cream coat that cost more than the shop's monthly rent, and looked around at the small space. 4 tables, a chalkboard menu, the smell of butter and cardamom, with an expression she did not bother to hide. Rosa, 67 now, silver hair in a braid over one shoulder, flour dusted along her forearms, came out from behind the counter wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Sophia's mother-in-law," Rosa said warmly, extending a hand. "She told me you'd be coming. I have 3 flavors ready." "I appreciate you making the time," Margaret said, not quite meeting the warmth. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Delgado, I have concerns. This is a very large wedding. I need to know you can handle something at that scale, with that level of precision." Rosa's hands, for just a moment, went still against her apron. She had run this shop alone for 11 years, had built 400 wedding cakes in a life that had never once made the society pages, had fed a grieving family without ever expecting a thank you card. She did not need Margaret Calloway's validation, but something in the woman's tone, the assumption that smallness meant insufficiency, settled into an old familiar place. "I can show you what I've done before," Rosa said evenly. "If that would help?" "It would," Margaret said. "Because right now, all I see is a shop that's charming for a birthday party. Not for the biggest day of my son's life." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when someone has said something they will later regret. Rosa did not answer right away. She turned instead, walked to the back of the shop, and returned carrying a thin photo album, its cover soft with age, corners worn from handling. She set it on the counter without a word and opened it to a page near the middle. There, in a photograph faded slightly at the edges, was an 11-year-old girl doing homework at a back table, a woman beside her frosting a cake. Both of them caught mid-laugh in a shop that had not changed in 18 years. "I wasn't going to say anything," Rosa said quietly. "Sophia asked me not to if it came to this. She didn't want it to feel like leverage. But you should know what this bakery actually is, before you decide what it isn't." Margaret stared at the photograph for a long moment before her eyes moved to Rosa's face, and something in her posture, the practiced certainty she wore like armor, began slowly to come undone. "Is that—" Margaret started, and stopped. "That's Sophia," Rosa said. "And that's her mother, Elena, working the counter beside me. This shop kept that family standing after Sophia's father died. I didn't do anything remarkable. I gave a grieving woman a job and let her daughter do her homework where it was warm. But I have watched Sophia grow up in the reflection of that display case, Mrs. Calloway. And when she asked me to make her wedding cake, it was not because I have the fanciest credentials in the city. It was because some rooms hold more history than others." Margaret sat down slowly in one of the small cafe chairs, the photograph still in her hands, and for the first time since Sophia had known her, she looked less like a woman running a wedding and more like a woman confronting how little she had actually understood about the family she was joining. "Sophia never told me any of this," Margaret said, almost to herself. "She wasn't hiding it," Rosa said gently. "She just didn't think it was anyone's business to prove her worth by. Some kindnesses aren't meant to be used as arguments. They're just meant to be remembered." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, turning the photograph over in her hands as if it might explain something she had spent 63 years not needing to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its edge entirely. "I'd like to see the 3 flavors," she said. "And I'd like to hear about the shop. All of it, if you're willing to tell me." Rosa smiled, the wariness in her shoulders easing for the first time since Margaret had walked in. "I'll put the kettle on." They talked for 2 hours. Margaret learned that Rosa had taught herself pastry from library books after immigrating at 19 with nothing but her mother's recipe box. She learned that the shop had survived 2 recessions, a fire in the kitchen next door, and 11 years of Rosa working alone because she had never been able to justify hiring help she couldn't be certain she could keep paying. By the time Margaret stood to leave, she was no longer discussing whether Rosa's bakery was sufficient for the wedding. She was asking whether Rosa would allow her to help cover the cost of a part-time assistant, so the shop might survive whatever came after this one very large cake. Rosa declined the money, gently but firmly. She had never once, in 18 years, accepted more than what was earned. But she accepted something else instead, Margaret's offer to mention the shop by name in the wedding program and to bring 3 friends from her circle in for tastings the following month. It was not charity. It was simply finally someone with reach choosing to point it somewhere it had never been pointed before. The wedding cake stood at the center of the reception 3 weeks later. 3 tiers of lemon and lavender, unassuming and exactly right. And when Sophia cut the first slice, her mother Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd with her hand pressed to her mouth, watching Rosa watch the whole room taste what had once quietly kept them alive. Margaret stood beside her, and for the first time in the entire engagement, she did not say a single word about scale or precision or what the